So I believe we're live now. Is that right? Well, you are all live. Great. Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here this afternoon. My name is Jake Rosenfeld from Washington University, St. Louis. This particular panel is the Teacher Strike Wave and the Effects of Work Stoppages Symposium. I want to give a special thanks to Peter Norlander for both proposing and organizing this great panel. We have 4 fantastic papers, 2 wonderful discussants. If you've joined by accident by any chance, stick around, it's going to be wonderful. The discussants we have today are William Spriggs of the Afl-Cio and Howard University, and Miss Stacy Davis-Gates, Vice President of the Chicago Teachers Union. We get kicked out of here 2 hours from now. I'd love there to be time for audience reactions, so I'm going to limit each of our speakers to 15 to 20 minutes for their remarks. For those of you who are in the audience, if you do have a question for any of the presentations, please put it in the Q&A. The chat is disabled for you. So with any luck, we'll have some time and I will kind of facilitate those questions after our discussants and the panelists' reactions to them. The presenters have agreed to go in the order of the program. So we are going to, without further ado, kick things off with Rebecca Givan from Rutgers University.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jake. And yeah, special thanks to Peter Norlander. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen for my presentation. Hopefully everybody can see it. And I want to say this might be the caveat that almost everyone's presentation gives. This, of course, when I dreamed up this idea, it was going to be a beautifully finished paper with all kinds of well-polished ideas and analyses. That was pre-pandemic. So this paper is stuff that I'm working on and thinking about and have been thinking about a lot, but it's in the very, very early stages, which means I'm very open to feedback. I'm very interested in feedback, and you'll see a lot of probably not fully formed ideas and other issues that that need to be eliminated before this progresses too much. So this this paper that I'm thinking about, that I'm working on, is a combination of, I guess, at least 2 different things. One is some theoretical questions about strikes and how the recent teacher strikes have, what they do to our understanding of strikes, our theorizing of strikes, our analysis of past strikes. Do they affirm things we thought we knew? Do they turn our knowledge on its head? What do they do? And then the second thing is a bit more descriptive, and I'll go into it. I've been collecting data on teachers' strikes. And if there are like strike nerds in attendance, we can talk about, there's a lot of questions when you get, sometimes when Stacy's people go on strike, you can tell that it's a strike, but there's also, sick outs where, how do you know, I'll preview, how do you know if it's a successful sick out when everybody is reporting different numbers of participation and school was only asynchronous anyway, right? So if a teacher during remote school did or didn't do their live class, but so there's a lot of questions and interesting definitional problems. So collecting the data to try to help understand what we do and don't know about strikes. So I'll get into some of these issues and how they all fit together. This very much draws from the recent volume that I co-edited with contributions from some wonderful scholars who many of you will be familiar with, and also some fantastic teachers, organizers, students, school bus drivers, about this recent set of strikes, 2018 and 2019 especially. And the sort of overarching questions are the basic questions: what happened, why did it happen, why is it happening, and is it different, right? And that is it different is not as much in the book, although we do get into it, but that's one of the things I'm really thinking about now. How does it fit with what we think we knew about strikes and about teachers' strikes? And I should say in the book, I should give a bit of a plug, I guess. It's always a little awkward, but we have really great contributions from some of the most amazing organizers, leaders. Stacy's member, Chris Barrett, who led, I think, the first charter strike in the entire country, has a beautiful chapter. Rebecca Gorelli from Arizona, Nicole McCormick from West Virginia, the president and vice president of the United Teachers of Los Angeles. So we tried not to have it be just an academic volume. So to ask the question, which I am not yet prepared to answer, do existing theories of strikes explain recent teacher strikes? That can get you into all kinds of literature and industrial relations and economics. And I was sort of drawn to this analysis by John Goddard of Richard Hyman's sort of formative book from the 70s on strikes. And there's this long period of time of asking, why are there no more strikes? So Richard Hyman was asking that in the 1970s. Now, later in the 1970s and into the 1980s, there were strikes in the UK where Richard Hyman is based. But at the time he was writing, there weren't. And then Goddard in 2011 is like, where are these strikes? And if you look at the data, it's like this massive dip in strikes. So I like this quote that Goddard highlighted from Hyman: those who predict the withering away of the strike commit the fallacy of assuming that short-term trends will continue indefinitely. And we see the return of the strike, right? So this is really a question about what does the return of the strike look like and what does it mean? And so that descriptive piece is what is it, what's happening, and then what does it mean and what can it tell us is the other piece. I'm not going to go extensively into different theories of strikes. I have not done enough thinking and creating and ripping apart different categories, using existing categories, deciding if they work or not. But just to highlight a few sort of areas to think about theories of strikes, and then where I kind of want to go, which doesn't necessarily come out of theories of strikes. The economists are probably most familiar with, the Hicks model and strikes as economically inefficient outcomes. Essentially, it's a waste. If you divided up how much money is spent on having a strike, you would be better just to settle. That's in a sort of bargaining context. For my money, that doesn't really work in the private sector. The costs look very different in most cases. For example, in a teacher strike, the local school district doesn't lose any revenue, right? Which is very different from a General Motors strike or a hotel strike, right? Where the management, the employer loses revenue. So the Hicks model, I think, is not the most useful. It's very, very dominant. I don't find it particularly useful in the public sector, although if people have applications to suggest, I'm definitely interested. Kaufman has this idea about the combination of the propensity to strike and the opportunity to strike, which I think is sort of interesting in that it uses a lot of different factors. I do think the institutional change is important, and I think the psychological factors, although I might not characterize them as psychological, but more like identity and experience. Also, Kaufman talks about rival unionism, different unions sort of trying to offer different things. And while I wouldn't say that there's rival unionism in the case of the recent teacher strikes, I do see a lot of, let's say, very vigorous union democracy, caucuses coming to power with the intent of building for a possible strike, and also these parallel structures. Eric Blanc has a great chapter in our book that talks about some of these parallel structures, like in Arizona, that build up to do what the union leadership is not necessarily doing. So they're not necessarily overturning that leadership, but they're working kind of regardless of what the union leadership is doing. And there's sort of many shades of that and different versions of that. So I think that's a different version of rival unionism. There's, a whole literature on psychological factors and feedback loops. The psychological factors, that's definitely outside of my expertise. So I'm interested in thinking more about that, but I'm very interested in the feedback loops piece. So Jane McAlevey argues vociferously, and in the book we had to make sure we didn't use the term strike wave in the in anywhere, because Jane argues, and I'm completely persuaded, that waves are natural and organic, and they come from nature. They don't come from human causes. Strikes come from organizing. Strikes don't come from nature. They don't just appear like a wave. But I think the concept of a feedback loop is very important. So it's not a wave, but it is a feedback loop. So, successful strikes beget more strikes. Strikes are in fact contagious. That's very clear. There's all kinds of data, and some that may be presented today, on how successful strikes influence other strikes. There's absolutely no doubt that all of the teachers who went on strike after West Virginia were very, very much looking at the success in West Virginia and informed by that. In my own work, I have used Paul Pierson a lot, and I yet again have started to think about how his work applies here. Pierson says policy creates politics. The most clear example he uses is Social Security as a policy created an organized interest group of Social Security beneficiaries, which kind of got organized into the AARP, which then constrains future policies. But I actually think that policy creates politics in terms of teachers' unions too, or educators' unions, because the neoliberalism, the austerity, the teacher pay penalty, all of that is intentional policy and creates ultimately belittled but ready to be activated teacher workforce. And that wouldn't have happened without all of those policies that sort of cut taxes, cut public funding for education, starved schools, and over a long period of time. So I think in this case, there's a sort of policy creates politics story. And I'm moving into sort of how to apply theories of social movements, of interest group politics and institutions that comes right out of using that Pearson analysis. So to this audience, it'll be familiar, the NLRA and state public sector bargaining laws pushed industrial conflict into collective bargaining with the express goal of eliminating strikes. But when the bargaining laws aren't working well, then we see a return of conflict. Similarly, the stifling of teachers' unions and the stifling of public sector strikes. Illinois has a clear case where the voting bar for a legal strike was raised to what the state legislature thought would be an impossible standard, but sure enough, the Chicago teachers were able to meet that standard. But when bargaining is not yielding satisfying outcomes, then it's time to try another path. I'm not going to go into this history. For many people here, you probably are familiar with it, but there's an arc from very conservative teachers' strikes, willingness to strike, but to defend due process and the status quo, often against racial justice demands, which weren't conceived of as racial justice, to this sort of neoliberal anti-union consensus with many centrist Democrats, Rahm Emanuel, Antonio Villaraigosa, leading right up to that CTU strike in 2012. And then we get into the strikes for the common good, these 2018, 2019, 2020 strikes as a backlash against austerity and neoliberalism, a real reaction to anti-union Democrats in blue cities and states, a resurgence of workplace organizing and rank and file activism, as I mentioned, either replacing running against entrenched union leadership that had been perhaps a little too quick to concede at the bargaining table, unwilling to strike, not really organizing, or in states without much bargaining that was trying to do sort of legislative advocacy, but with mixed success. And then, of course, digital organizing, and especially in the cases where it was successful, the sort of online to offline, which is, I think, best exemplified in Arizona. And the massive, massive rise of common good demands. So racial justice demands, tax increases, end to charterization, and many, many more. So that's the sort of very, very brief version of the arc that we're seeing. So then I get into this sort of data that I've been collecting about strikes. And I am thinking a lot about how to categorize strikes. I have a notion of sort of traditional strikes, which are sometimes just considered renewal strikes. The contract has expired, you're stuck at the bargaining table, so you go on strike. And then what I'm thinking about the contentious social movements literature, sort of less traditional strikes that are either not over contract renewal, so places where there are no collective bargaining rights, like or very limited, like West Virginia and Arizona, Oklahoma, Kentucky, or cases where there might be collective bargaining, but it is illegal to go on strike. So I put Dedham, Massachusetts in that category. There's a few other little ones where strikes are clearly illegal. There is bargaining, but strikes are not allowed. Again, I say strikes, sick-outs, and lobby days. As you start counting these things, the questions of definition become really, really complicated. So there's, in places like North Carolina, statewide lobby days where the schools were closed. And so that's one thing I'm thinking about. If my definition of a sort of successful work stoppage or strike is the schools are closed, then I can use that, but that every definition changes things a little bit. So we have clear strikes, but we also have much more complicated cases where you could really get into it on your definitions. And if I'm going to do anything that involves ones and zeros and yeses and nos in the data, I'll have to make some decisions that I've mostly avoided so far. So I created this strike database with support of some great graduate assistants. In terms of, some of you guys are probably familiar with the existing data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We all know, sadly, I shouldn't say sadly, they are wonderful, and I hope they'll get a massive infusion of funding starting on January 20th. And they track strikes over 1,000 workers. That's of limited utility for teacher strikes. It's okay with a statewide strike, and it's okay with a big city strike, but other than that, it doesn't help. So in suburban Seattle a couple of years ago, there was a series of coordinated strikes in numerous school districts. None of them are in the BLS data because each district had fewer than 1,000 workers. Bloomberg also has a proprietary database, which does not have that size limit on it. So that's helpful. So we've used those sources and added local news sources, as well as union internal data from one of the two major education unions that does track this, and sort of triangulated all of it. As I mentioned, one of the big challenges is, what is a strike? And then we're also trying to collect more detailed data that the BLS wouldn't necessarily get. So we can get the bargaining unit size. It's very hard to get participation. It's even harder to get demands and wins. Still in the process of figuring out what exactly I need and how to get it. And I thought, since this is a conference with more economists than where I usually am, I should show what we get when we don't just rely on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So in some years, you get the same number. 2015, there were very few strikes, but they were all over 1,000. In other years, you miss every strike if you use that threshold. So you can see that you do, I would say you add quite a lot. And if you're going to do any kind of data analysis, you probably want to know what's going on in smaller strikes, not just big city strikes, if you're going to say something sort of bigger. What difference does that issue with the data make? Well, this is my data. So this is the sort of, I would say the sort of headlines, and you see that bottom right number is heavily inflated because of this complexity of big sick outs. As I mentioned, pandemic work stoppages are really hard to figure out. Whether school was really closed and what that means. So don't worry about that 2020 number, but you see both the days lost to strikes and the students impacted really going up and up following a sort of early push with 2012 in Chicago, but then it died down for several years, with a major exception being one Seattle strike. And then it starts to come back in 2016, and then 2018 and 19 are huge. And some of those bigger numbers are from the student impacted numbers are from big one-day strikes that were sort of lobby days in, as I mentioned, North Carolina. And I want to be wrapping up, so I will get to the last couple of slides just to see again, if you only include the BLS strikes, some years you get the same number, and some years you miss hundreds of thousands of students impacted by strikes. And so when we get to what Alex and co-authors are going to tell us about, I think that's significant, right? When we're learning about the effect of strikes on families that experience them, and there's hundreds of thousands more families experiencing them, then we can think about electoral and other consequences. So to get into what I want to do with these sort of theoretical and definitional questions, thinking about the outcomes of strikes and how they're different. And I know that in key demands made and key demands won, and I'm really excited to hear from Chantal about the sort of successful demands. I don't consider winning a demand the only measure of a successful strike, but it's obviously something important. The role of bargaining for the common good, so things like parent and student organizing, how much was there in these cases, and then did the demands that came from this organizing end in wins? Often they're not technically at the bargaining table. You can look at gains in education funding and educator pay, which may be in bargaining, but also in legislation, or in the case of Arizona in the recent election, at the ballot box, right? Although there's also been failure at the ballot box in California. So that's also worth, I think, adding in to look at when you look at the outcomes of strikes. And then just returning to that question of, do these existing theories of strikes explain them? And I would say, I don't think so. And then what theories can we use to explain them? So that's sort of where I'm going with this data analysis, and how I hope it will help amplify our theory. With this small number of strikes, I'm not expecting to do massively fancy econometric analysis, which is good because that's not generally my methodological approach anyway, but I think it can really inform our theoretical thinking. So I think I'm just right about on time, and I will stop screen sharing and pass it back. So thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and you did make it in on time. Next up, we have a trio from Columbia University, Alex Hertel-Fernandez, Suresh Naidu, and Adam Reich.
Great, thanks so much, Jake, and thanks so much to Peter for organizing, although he can't be here, to Bill and to Stacy for discussing. It's really a privilege to be on this panel with so many people whose work we're engaging with, but also folks who are out there in the labor movement, engaging in a lot of the collective actions that we're studying. So in many ways, I feel like this is such a great crowd to be discussing this research. So let me just pull up my slides here, and I'll say again that this is co-authored work with Suresh Naidu and Adam Reich, who are both here on this panel, as well as Patrick Youngblood, who unfortunately can't make it. We're all affiliates of the Columbia University Labor Lab, which is an academic center at Columbia University, where we use social science methods to understand worker organization and collective action. So in many ways, it's great to be following Rebecca's work, because we really want to understand a lot of the mobilization that she was laying out, and that she covers so well in the edited volume that she mentioned, Strike for the Common Good, this wave of teacher strikes and collective action that unfolded over the past several years. And we really have two sets of questions that we're wanting to answer and explore in this work. So we might say that they're divided into an external set of questions and an internal set of questions, external and internal to the labor movement and to worker organizing efforts. So externally, we're really interested in this question of feedback loops, as Rebecca put it, which is to say, how have the strikes and mobilizations that have happened in public sector schools, in the education sector over the past several years, how have they changed politics within these within their states? In particular, how have they changed the way that the broader public, including parents and especially parents of children who are in affected schools, how have they changed the way they think about the labor movement and the teachers who are engaging in these collective actions? And the next phase of this research, which we're currently engaged in, aims to answer internal questions. How are they organized? And in particular, the cut that I want to show you today from our analysis aims to answer the question of what their relationship to existing labor unions and other social movements is. As I'll lay out more in a moment, there have been, I think, some coverage of these mobilizations that have stressed how they have been separate from and sometimes in tension with traditional labor unions. And so we really want to understand, what is the relationship between the sort of activists who are engaged in this action and these more formal labor institutions and other social movements that are unfolding at the same time. Okay, so let me take each of these questions in turn, starting with the external question of how strikes have affected the broader political context in which they've unfolded. As we'll hear about more in a moment from Nathan and Maxim, there's been a large and growing literature, including with contributions from Jake and others, on how strikes affect economic outcomes like wages and employment, but we know far less about how they affect political outcomes and especially public opinion. We might think this is important for at least two sets of outcomes, downstream outcomes that we might care about. One of them is politics and electoral and legislative politics, to the extent that strikes change public opinions in ways that create new demands on lawmakers. You might think that policy might shift in a direction that could advantage or disadvantage the striking workers in the labor movement. And secondarily, there may be effects on workers themselves who are not immediately involved in the strikes. People may see collective action that's unfolding and decide to engage in or at least learn about labor action that they would not have engaged in otherwise as a result of seeing these strikes, particularly successful strikes. And so that really leads us to these three sets of hypotheses that we'd like to test. So the first set of hypotheses focuses on the possibility for public sector labor action, like the teachers' strikes that unfolded in 2018 and 2019, to convince parents, those most affected by the mobilizations, given the fact that their children are in schools that are shut down or at least affected by the mobilization. We aim to test whether or not these kinds of strikes can convince parents that the teachers are seeking public goods that benefit the parents and their children. And we might think that this would translate into greater support among these communities, these affected communities, for both the workers, in this case teachers, as well as their unions or labor organizations. Cutting against that is the hypothesis that mass public sector strikes could actually lead to less support for the striking workers and for labor organizations. We have evidence, including work that Suresh and Adam has done, that have shown that during labor collective actions, there's a reduction in the quality of services and products that are produced by striking workers. And you might think that this might lead parents, particularly given that education is so crucial to children's well-being, might lead them to become less supportive of the striking teachers. And certainly you saw many conservative politicians in the states where teacher strikes were unfolding, trying to draw attention to the negative effects of the strikes on children and their parents. But these are in opposition to one another. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we're interested in testing what we might call an imitation or inspiration hypothesis, that seeing this kind of collective action by workers might inspire workers who are not involved in those protests to engage in further collective action, or at least to become interested in labor action themselves. And so the context for all of this is the 2018 to 2019 teacher strikes. And more specifically, we're interested in mobilizations that unfolded in Arizona, Colorado, Kentucky, Oklahoma, North Carolina, and West Virginia. In addition to that, and after our study ends, there have been a number of mobilizations, including formal strikes in a number of other states. But we're focused on what we might think of as the original set of widespread teacher walkouts and mobilizations that happened at the statewide level, particularly in 2018, but also extending into early 2019. And I think I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about our choice to analyze these together, as opposed to thinking about these other city level or local level mobilizations, as well as some differences between how the mobilizations unfolded in these different states, but we think we're on solid ground thinking about them together. And to answer the question of how public opinion changed in these states, we use a variety of different data sources, and I'll talk about two of them in the rest of my presentation. The first is internal monthly polling conducted of registered voters, a nationally representative sample of registered voters conducted by the Afl-Cio from February 2016 to November 2018. And we're going to look specifically at the states in which strikes or widespread mobilizations, statewide mobilizations of teachers occurred, and whether or not public sentiment towards the labor movement changed pre and post strikes. In addition, I'm going to talk about an original online survey we commissioned of nearly 4,500 respondents in these 6 states administered through Qualtrics. It was an opt-in internet panel that we commissioned that matched demographic targets on a variety of characteristics, including, importantly, to get a large sample of parents of who were plausibly affected by the strikes that were unfolding in their children's schools. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. Okay, so for the Afl-Cio polling data, our main outcome that we're going to be looking at is a standard feelings thermometer where respondents are asked how warm or cold they feel towards a particular group or actor, in this case, the labor movement, from a 0 to 100 scale, where higher values indicate more positive or warmer assessments. On average, unions fall at a little below 50%, and I've included some descriptive statistics that give you a sense of how this varies by, for instance, political ideology. Our main explanatory variable is a binary indicator for whether or not a strike or a walkout or a protest happened in a particular state. So taking advantage of the longitudinal nature of the data. We include a variety of demographic controls that you can see on the screen there. And the standard is the setup is pretty standard in terms of an OLS regression with robust standard errors. I'll show the results from 3 different specifications here that show in turn the addition of state and survey fixed effects, as well as demographic controls. And you can see that in our favored model, there's about a 10 percentage point difference between public sentiments towards labor unions after the strikes as compared to before the strikes. And that's equivalent to about 1/3 of a standard deviation on the thermometer indicator. So this presents, we think, suggestive evidence that after the strikes and protests unfolded in these states, respondents to these surveys indicated more positive assessments of the labor movement. And in results that we show and document more in the paper that was distributed, we show that these effects are larger for parents rather than non-parents, which are suggestive of the effects being largest for people who may have had the largest firsthand contact with the strikes. And that's something that we'll be able to probe in a little bit more detail in the second set of data that I mentioned, which is this original Qualtrics survey in the 6 states where the statewide strikes or protests unfolded. Here, we're interested in a broader range of potential outcomes. Since we designed the survey, we can add a lot more detailed questions about public perceptions of the teachers who were on strike, as well as a variety of other indicators of support for the labor movement. So we ask things like, how much do you personally support or oppose the walkouts that occurred? Did you participate in any of these walkouts? How much do you support important policies that are relevant for teachers, things like the right to strike, collectively bargain, or collect agency fees, support for future strikes that might unfold in your state or community, a behavioral indicator of whether or not you wanted to donate money to support the Los Angeles Teachers Strike Fund, which was preparing to go on strike at the time of the survey, and whether or not you might support greater influence of the labor movement more generally in American society. In addition to those attitudinal outcomes, we also asked respondents who reported that they were employed at the time of the survey if they were interested in supporting a union at their own job, using the standard question that's often fielded on surveys, as well as a question about strike interest. How interested are you in going on strike at your place of work, again, among employed respondents? Again, we have a variety of controls that you can see on this slide. I'll be talking about results that take advantage of the fact that we oversampled parents. And so we can look at parents who have children whose ages put them either just in school or just out of school, taking advantage of the fact that children aging above 5 or older, or 17 or older, are likely to be either just in school or just out of school. And we can use that as an instrument for parents exposure to the strikes. If you're interested in the full array of specifications, the reduced form specifications, the regressions that document that this instrument is indeed a valid way of trying to think about parental exposure to strikes, you can check out our paper, but I'll just present some summary regressions here that show our two-stage least squares estimates of exposure to the walkouts on parental views about teachers' unions, as well as personal interest in the labor movement, taking advantage of having a just school-age child as an instrument for that strike exposure. And what we see here is that an averaged index of attitudes towards the labor movement, as well as interest in going on strike oneself, both appear as outcomes that are affected by strike exposure, as measured and proxied for by having this just school-aged child. So parents who were exposed to these strikes appear to be more favorable towards the labor movement generally, and teachers specifically, as well as more interested in potentially going on strike themselves at their own job. While the coefficient for strike exposure on voting for union representation is positive, it's more noisily estimated and smaller in magnitude than the other coefficients on these other outcomes. We can't say much about interest in voting for a union, but we do have consistent estimates that, particularly for the strike interest outcome, that strike exposure seems to be changing the way that people are thinking about the labor movement. In the paper, we dig into mechanisms and subgroup effects in a little bit more detail. I'll just mention two findings that we think are especially illuminating. One of them looks at heterogeneity in the strike exposure effect by political ideology. And we find that whether it's political ideology or partisan identification, we find that adults who we might think were union skeptics before the strikes were more likely to be moved by the strikes into being interested in going on strike themselves. So if we divide our sample into liberals, moderates, and conservatives, you can see that strike exposure seems to only be associated with interest in going on strike for conservatives and not for more liberal or moderate respondents. And again, we find similar results looking at partisan ID. We also find some suggestive evidence that personal cost may matter as well, dividing our sample between adults who said that they were single parents versus those who were married or had a partner who might be able to take care of the child. We found that our results were largely driven by parents who were married or partnered. And while we can't say too much more about the subgroup finding, we think that it might have something to do with the personal costs that were incurred by parents during the strikes who didn't have reliable childcare. That the personal cost that was imposed by the strikes may have had an effect here. Okay. So now in my remaining time, I want to say a little bit more about what we're doing on the internal effects of labor mobilization around the strikes and protests. And in particular, think a little bit about what our data can say about the relationship between the teacher walkouts and strikes and traditional teachers' unions and other social movements. As I mentioned at the top, on the one hand, media coverage of the strikes and anecdotal accounts really stress the ways that this unfolded separate from traditional labor unions. There's a lot of attention directed to the fact that the West Virginia teachers went on strike, and that was not initially authorized by the leaders of the union. And again, when the teachers were unsatisfied with the deal that the teachers union leadership had reached with the elected officials in the state. In addition, I think there's been a lot of great coverage talking about how the initial impetus for a lot of the mobilization on social media, Facebook in particular, that happened as a result of the fact that teachers didn't feel well represented by the traditional labor unions in their states. For all these reasons, we might expect that the activism and energy that happened around the Red for Ed movement was happening apart from the traditional labor movement. On the other hand, I think there's a long tradition of research on social movements that gives us really strong theoretical expectations that activists might be building on the resources of these more traditional institutions. And we're going to look at that, this question in the context of North Carolina. And I think it's interesting because this was not a state that had a full-blown strike initially and had a very legally weak union because of state law restrictions on the union's collective bargaining rights. So in this case study, we have access to some key interviews with actors, including Red for Ed organizers, local and state union leaders, and leaders of the state union caucus, supplementing that with a close reading of the media record in the state, a scraping of all of the posts that were hosted on an internal private Facebook group for teachers to organize collective actions, and then a survey that we conducted of participants on this Facebook group, which was separate from the teachers union, but that was key to organizing a lot of the initial actions that were held in that state, leading up to several days of protest on the state capitol. So I just want to show two quick empirical quantitative results from that survey data, which is where we're looking at a variety of covariates of total acts of Red for Ed participation in 2018 and 2019 from people sampled from this Facebook group. And I just want to draw your attention to two of the coefficients here in this regression plot, current union members and post-2016 resistance participation, that show that individuals and teachers and educators who were involved in their union were actually much more likely to participate in Red for Ed actions than were non-union members. And in addition, we find that folks who had been participating in the post-2016 resistance movements were also substantially more likely to be participating in the Red for Ed movement, suggesting that the Red for Ed activism in this state may have been closely tied to the traditional labor union and also other movements that were unfolding at that time. So let me just wrap up now with some tentative conclusions, both about the external question that I posed at the beginning and this internal question. So what can we take away from the external facing results? I think one conclusion that we can take away is that these sort of mass public sector strikes that of the sort that happened in 2018 and 2019 can increase support for workers and their unions, even when they pose pretty significant disruptions to the people who are consuming these public sector services, children and parents. And as we described in more detail in the paper that we circulated, we think a key mechanism for this is really political education, the work that the teachers were doing to convey to parents the fact that they were pushing for public goods that would benefit children, parents, and the broader communities. That said, we also find some role for the personal costs that parents were facing. And I think this suggests that the efforts that unions and teachers were engaged in at the time to help deal with these costs, for instance, distributing food to kids who would normally receive their breakfast or lunches at the schools, providing childcare to parents who didn't have other options during the strike, or even hosting solidarity schools, as happened in California, that all of these things were really important to try to minimize the sort of backlash effects that would otherwise come about from the strikes. And I think the last thing to say is that, you know, mass public sector strikes may be important not just for their economic effects, as Nathan and Maxim may have more to say about in a moment, but that they may play an important role in teaching other workers about the possibilities of labor collective action at a time when many people just don't have a lot of union exposure because union density is so low. And so strikes may be an important way that you start getting to these feedback effects that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning of her talk, that can inspire greater collective action and greater unionization interest among broader segments of the population. So I think I'll end there, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and your questions, particularly as we think about where to go next with these questions and this data.
Thank you so much, Alex. Our third presentation today, joint effort by Maxim Massenkoff of Berkeley and Nathan Wilmers of MIT.
Okay, thanks everyone for being here and for having us. This is a talk on the effects of strikes, and it's joint work with Nathan Wilmers at MIT, and I'm Maxim. So as Rebecca mentioned in her talk, there's a long history of sort of looking around and asking why there's so little striking. So I think that the researcher she was citing was writing in the 1970s. So here we are kind of looking at data since the 1970s and then saying again, oh, it seems like strikes are really down. So we're starting with this, I think, well-known observation. And here showing you this from both the firm and the worker level perspective. So the red line is showing you just a count of strikes from the BLS, which only counts strikes with over 1,000 workers, but it's our series that extends back the furthest. And then the FMCS, which is a more broader accounting of strikes. And then the blue series are showing you counts from the CPS. So at the worker level, how many people are reporting that they were recently involved in a labor dispute. And then we see it just kind of precipitously drops off in the 70s and 80s. So since the 1980s, the frequency of strikes has fallen by about an order of magnitude. And this decline has outpaced the fall in union membership. So there are several potential explanations for this change. And here we'll highlight three. So one is that strikes are no longer effective, perhaps due to the use of strike replacements. So the most prominent episode here is the air traffic controller strike of 1981, which might have led to a really big shift in the norms and tactics around the use of replacement workers. There's also a perspective that this arises from principal agent problems. So I think Alex was commenting on this a little bit at the end, where strikes may still work for gaining worker bargaining leverage, but because of the kind of increased bureaucratization of the organizations, union leaders pass up on this opportunity because their incentives are different from the member workers. And finally, there's the economic perspective that Rebecca also highlighted, which starts with the premise that every strike is sort of wasteful because the two parties could have, at the beginning of negotiations, arrived at the agreement that they eventually got to after the strike. So if we see that strikes have declined, this is the sign of a positive change, that the two parties are better able to communicate at the outset, better able to credibly signal their position. And so this is something about the bargaining process improving. And so what we're going to do in this paper is slice off like a smaller part of these potential explanations and just think more about what exactly strikes do for workers before and after 1980, the sort of critical period around the air traffic controller strike. So we're doing this at two levels. The first is at the person level. So here we're combining person level data from the PSID, the CPS, and the SIP to study the effect of strikes on reported wages. And then we're also going to zoom a level out and look at the bargaining unit level. So here we're using newly digitized collective bargaining agreements to study the effects of strikes on raise schedules, in case there's something about our worker level analysis that's being missed. And so a few notable papers to point out here. At the person level, there's a study from Wallenstein and Grant from 1993, which uses worker level survey data from 1979 and finds a 10% wage premium for workers who ever go on strike. So a difficulty here is that these are just this is cross-sectional data on workers and just studying whether they've ever been on strike in their lives. So the strike could have happened 20 years ago. So it's a little bit hard to interpret that kind of 10% wage boost. There's also Jake's 2006 paper, which combines the CPS and FMCS data to find no effect of regional strike activity on wages. So I think this paper actually does comment perhaps a little bit on the feedback loops that we've been discussing throughout this session. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear more conversation on that. But a way that we extend this use of worker level data is to do this with worker fixed effects, because we're kind of utilizing the panel structure of the data sets that we have, which means that we could study what happens to wages before and after a strike. So that's going to be one kind of critical addition to our analysis, which is kind of similar to studying the union wage premium. So it's might be a little bit more convincing to be able to study the same worker both before and after they joined a union, and at similar point with strikes. At the collective bargaining agreement level, there are two very similar papers. One's from McConnell from 1989, which looks at the effects of strikes on wages using contract data from the US, and then one from David Card from 1988, which does the same in Canada. And in both cases, they find no effects of strikes on wages. The way that we extend this is we've got a much bigger data set with 8 times as many contracts, twice as many strikes compared to McConnell's paper, and kind of we're extending this into recent years. And throughout, a key contribution which comes from our use of the PSID is that we can compare effects both before and after 1980. So all of the papers cited here are just happening on one side of that critical juncture. So first I'll talk about our person level data. So we're using the PSID, the CPS, and the SIP. And these are all panel surveys, which means each respondent is surveyed multiple times. And they include a question on strikes and labor disputes. So we're going to use these person level data to study if workers earn more after a strike, so if they get higher wages. And this provides some of the first person level evidence on strikes, separate from Wallace, Light, and Grant, which we mentioned earlier. And so we think it might be worth highlighting these questions because for a long time, they seem to have been untouched by researchers. But the way that the PSID asks about this is an annual survey, and it asks, during the last year, did you miss any work because you were on strike? And then the respondent can answer yes or no. In the CPS and SIP, this is a question that happens conditional on the respondent missing some work in a previous week. So if they indicate that they've missed work, then there's a question about that respondent, which is why were they absent from work? And then one of the options in that list in both surveys is that they could be absent due to a labor dispute. So when we use these several different questions to identify strikers in our data, this is the count of strikers that we get across the 3 different data sources. And you can see it roughly mirrors the pattern in overall striking activity, although you can see our sample that includes wage information on these individual workers starts a lot later. So we've only got a few hundred workers who were striking in the 1970s from our PSID data. These workers are going to be really critical. And then another thing to point out here is that basically none of the workers in the recent teacher strikes can be expected to be included in this data because most of these series kind of trail off in the very end. And we've got very few strikers in recent years, although we might be able to extend some of these sources. And so here's just some basic descriptive averages showing the characteristics of strikers. So this is from the SIP, although these patterns are going to be the same across the PSID and the CPS as well. Just to give you a sense of the sample, in the SIP, we've got 1,000 strikers, and they're less likely to be female. They're slightly older, and they have higher wages. Next, we're using a pretty standard regression framework here. So we're estimating this equation in labeled as equation 1 using OLS. So YIT here is the hourly earnings for worker I in period T. XIT is going to be an indicator which switches from 0 to 1 if this survey is being completed after an absence from work due to a labor dispute. And in the PSID, we're going to interact this variable XIT with a pre-1980 dummy because we think there's something really special about that 1970s period. Next, alpha I denotes person fixed effects. So this hasn't been possible in other studies. Here we're able to kind of study the before and after change in wages, comparing a worker before to after their strike, conditional on these other controls. And finally, the vector WIT is going to have time fixed effects and controls such as age and education, as well as geography and industry fixed effects. And we're starting with the PSID because, as we've been saying, this is the only detailed data that allows us to study strikes before 1980. So this is a picture of a table of our main results showing the effects of strikes on wages. And so I'm going to start with this bottom column here, or this bottom row here. So the coefficient on post strikes here is 0 in the first kind of simplest specification. And then as we add controls, it gets increasingly negative, although none of these estimates are statistically significant. But what this means is that strikers after the 1980s don't show any significant gain in wages. And this effect can rule out wage gains, at least in this most stringent specification of about 1%. So the upper end of the 95% confidence interval is about a 1% increase in wages. Next, when we move up a row to this interaction term, this is telling us what happens to strikers in the PSID who were on strike in the 1970s. And so there's a huge difference here, which is that 1970 strikers see a gain in wages after their strike of between 6 and 10%, which is what we get from summing up these two coefficients here to account for that main effect. So there is this really large positive effect for strikers in the 1970s, but not afterwards. And we can take this same finding and put it through a standard event study framework. So here we're performing a very similar exercise, except we're looking at the typical annual trajectory of wages for the workers who strike in the PSID, and again, splitting by workers who were striking in the 70s versus workers who were striking afterwards. And so the red line again shows that very large bump in wages the year that the worker goes on strike, whereas the blue line for workers who were striking after the 1970s shows no such wage gain over time. So next we'll turn to our two other panel data sets where we have worker level surveys on both wages and strike activity, where again, a critical point is that this is only going to cover workers who are striking after the 1980s. So this would be a few tables, but just to give a verbal summary of results, we find no evidence of wage benefits in the CPS or SIP. So this basically replicates that sort of bottom row that we had in the PSID results, which is that strikers after the 1980s don't appear to have any higher wages after they strike. So in both data sets, the strikers see a decrease in their hourly wage of between 0 and 1%. So this is an insignificant result. And the 95% confidence interval in these two data sets is going to rule out effects as large as a 2% gain in wages. So one possibility that's explored in Jake Rosenfeld's book is that unions have become less likely to strike over wages. So unions are striking over other amenities. So for instance, a paper by Sojourner et al. Finds that unionization decreases hours in nursing homes. And we can kind of study these amenity effects in the SIP data because the SIP records hours and it records whether the employer is paying for part or all of the respondent's health insurance. And we can just look at whether the worker is still employed. So looking at the SIP, we put these different outcomes on the left-hand side, and we similarly find no effects on hours, no effects on whether the employer is covering the worker's insurance, and no effects on job stability. So whether the worker is staying employed compared to the kind of implicit control group in these specifications. Okay, so next I'll shift to the analysis of the collective bargaining agreements that we've compiled. So here, this allows us to directly study the raise schedule, which is not explicitly going to be recorded in the worker level data. So to do this, we're combining two sources. This is the FMCS strike data, which should have all strikes from authorized unions, and almost exclusively private companies, although in some cases the FMCS is brought in to mediate in public negotiations. Next, we're using collective bargaining data from the Bloomberg BNA database. So this is data on collective bargaining agreements where we've gone through to kind of code the text of the raise that was the raise schedule that was agreed upon into sort of quantitative data. And we're matching these two sources using a string matching technique based on the location and the firm name. So here are descriptives of the collective bargaining agreements that do not have a strike and those that are linked to a strike in the FMCS data. So they don't have any large differences that kind of jump out at you. The one is that the collective bargaining agreements that do have a strike seem to cover slightly smaller bargaining units. And then at the bottom, you can also see the number of observations that we have in the two categories. So this corresponds to a strike rate of about 3%, much lower than the data that than in the data that McConnell was studying from the 70s, where the strike rate was closer to 17%. And our results on contracts can basically be summarized in this plot, just showing you the raw averages. So here, we're just taking the average percent raise across the 3 or 4 years that the contract covered. And so this shows that, on average, the percent raise is between 2 and 4% each year. And then the red line is the percent raise for collective bargaining agreements that were linked to a strike. And the blue line is the average for collective bargaining agreements that were not linked to a strike. And all there is to point out here is that the two series track each other very closely. So strike-linked contracts do not show higher or lower raises. And then we can take this same finding, which is kind of visible in the raw averages, and subject it to more controlled regressions where we include fixed effects for the company. So just comparing like within bargaining unit changes, or fixed effects for the industry by state by year. So to cover for any like regional effects in certain industries, and also varying the window of strike inclusion. So one of the kind of choices that we had to make was how to label a collective bargaining agreement as being linked to a strike. And so we could have a window of, whether a strike happened a year or 2 years before it was ratified and so on. But it actually, it doesn't matter how you set the time window. The results consistently reject any kind of economically significant positive effects of the strike on the raise schedule. Okay, so summing up, we find that on average, striking workers have not gained relative to non-striking workers, at least since 1980. And our person level data bolsters evidence that strikes fundamentally changed in the 1980s. Next, our contracts analysis, which is done with a few decades of more recent data, is extending McConnell's findings that raises our no hire under strikes. And kind of looking at the historical literature on this, one account from Brecher that's often cited is that strikes in recent years have gotten nasty, brutish, and long. And so if strikes are longer now and striking workers are kind of moving further down on their resistance curve and accepting lower wages, then that could be one mechanism through which strikes have become less potent. But actually, if we plot at least the average log duration of strikes over time, kind of extending this using 3 different data sets, we only see that there's been a decrease in the typical duration, at least looking at it this way. So so maybe this helps rule out one of the accounts of why strikes might have gotten less potent. So in conclusion, we think that strikes could still be costly for firms, if not directly beneficial for workers, which would still make it an important bargaining tool. And as a next step, we're working on getting pre-1980 data on collective bargaining agreements to try to tie all these results together. So yeah, if anybody has advice on that, we're all ears, and that's all we've got for today, and we look forward to hearing your reactions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for our final presentation of the day, we have Chantel Smith from Howard University.
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute. Still don't have it down pat. Sorry, y'all. First of all, thank you guys for having me. Again, my name is Chantel Smith. I am a PhD candidate at Howard University. I'm also a fellow at the American Federation of Teachers in the Research and Strategic Initiatives Department. And I'm also a former high school teacher from a state that does not have collective bargaining. So excuse me if you tend to feel where I'm kind of skewing towards one way or another. So what I wanted to look at is teacher strikes in the Chicago Public School District. At the beginning, when I first looked at this data or attempted to gather this data at the beginning of this year, I too, like Rebecca, had these plans to have this long, big, extensive set and compare the 87 strike with the 2012 strike, but I was not able to get access to the 1987 data. So I just did this is what I have, and it's in a very early stages, so please, any feedback I would appreciate. Hold on, struggling. There it is. Okay. So just for a little bit of background, first of all, the state of Illinois has over 850 school districts. And the Chicago public school system has more than 600 schools. They serve over 400,000 students. They hire over 23,000 teachers. And the Chicago Teachers Union was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, teachers union in the United States, originating from the Chicago Federation of Teachers. That was founded in 1897 and finally joined up with the American Federation of Teachers as local number 1 in 1937. However, there's been a long history of strikes in the CPS school system. Since 1969, there's been 11 strikes. The longest one was in 1987. I was actually living in the area at that time. And most of the strikes were most directly about teacher pay, either the actual pay or something that would affect the pay, like increasing in health insurance premiums coming out of the teachers' checks. But in more recent years, there's been 2 major acts that I think contributed to the 2012 strike. One was the Performance Evaluation Reform Act in 2010. And that act said that school districts must use a minimum of 30% of the teacher evaluations must be based on student achievement, on standardized test scores, student standardized tests when we get it out. And the other thing that was very important that probably kicked off the actual strike was Illinois Senate Bill number 7. And that bill stated that teachers were not permitted to strike over salary disputes. And as soon as that bill was passed, the CPS rescinded the previously promised annual pay raise of 4%. So this was, of course, during a bargaining year. So they decided to rescind that offer. And now we're back at the bargaining table. We're trying to figure out, how can we get together on these things? So some of the issues that the CTU bargained on was because they could not strike over salary, they wanted to protect the pay scale relative to teacher experience and education. They also wanted to only have the minimum, that 30% minimum of the teacher evaluations based on student standardized test scores, where CPS had previously indicated they were going to increase that number to 45%. They also wanted more teacher autonomy. They wanted more important new curricula, standards, and technologies, and to increase investment in infrastructure. And so while the 2019 strikes are definitely more the bargain for the common good, the 2012 strike in Chicago really was where I saw it first begin to look at quality of life issues and not just salary issues, where they talked about things that were important to the community and not just trying to increase teacher pay. So the strike ended on September 18th. A lot of the CTU asks were met in some form or another. The CPS did get a win in agreeing to the lengthening of the school day, but by and large, the teachers union was relatively successful in achieving their ultimate goal at the bargaining table. So my research questions is I wanted to look at what impact did the strike have on three important things: student-teacher ratio, per pupil expenditures, and the instructional per pupil expenditures. And if any of the surrounding districts that are surrounding the CPS, are there any spillover effects? And I'll kind of get into why I thought those were important when we look at the literature in a few minutes. So my results were that on the student-teacher ratio, very minimal impact from the strike. The total per pupil expenditure increased both in the full sample and in the restricted sample, and same could be found for the instructional expenditures, but I forgot to put that last one on there. So the literature, I really just looked at I looked at a lot of literature, but the two I wanted to point out here were Lovenheim and Willen, which basically says that there are negative effects of exposure to teacher collective bargaining on long run labor market outcomes for people that were exposed to it. And they really supported the rent sinking hypothesis that Caroline Hawksby supports, which is basically saying that in order to better teachers is at the expense of students, because where is this money coming from except for taking away from other things that are important to students in order for the teachers to increase their salaries. And that reallocation of resources makes the collective bargaining less effective. However, the one that really stood out to me was this Vachon and Ma paper in 2015. And I like this idea of the two types of unionism: industrial unionism, which focuses on the economic portion, and professional unionism that focuses on the kind of the value added, the class size, the autonomy, more of the for the common good type of things. And what Vachon and Ma found was that both of these types of unionism are positively associated with student achievement, though the larger effect is probably seen in the industrial side versus the professional side. And I like the idea of this because when you look at teachers being, evaluated partially based on student achievement scores on standardized tests, where there's a lot that goes into what affects a student's performance on a standardized achievement test. So if teachers are going to be evaluated on that, then perhaps it is the role of the union to include some of those things in their asks. But that's just neither here. So I gathered data from the Common Core of Data on the NCS website from 2010 to 2014. And again, I made two sample sets, one which is CPS versus all the other districts in Illinois. And then I narrowed the scope from to CPS versus just the adjacent school districts. So that would be all the rest of the school districts in Cook County, as well as neighboring counties. And this was, my methodology. This is a standard difference in difference regression, where the variable interest is the beta 3. And this is the descriptive statistics, and we can see the means of the total PPE and instructional PPE for the entire sample. And this is what I wanted to really look at. So I did the parallel trends for each of the outcomes. And we can see here that when you look at CPS versus all the other districts, and the CPS is in the blue, is the blue line, that compared to all the other districts in the state of Illinois, the student-teacher ratio was significantly higher. The expenditure per pupil is also higher, and we also see that after the strike, that did go up, and that's for all the total expenditures. And here we have the instructional PPE. And again, we see that same sharp increase after 2013, as we saw in the full expenditure panel, which may be that the portion of the total expenditure was completely made up of the instructional expenditures, meaning that perhaps we do see that the resources are being shifted from one place to another versus an additional investment in students by the state. And these are my regression results here with the variable interest. Again, very minimum difference in the student-teacher ratio. We do see here that it did go up here for the total expenditures, and the instructional expenditures as well went up by a much more significant amount. When I restricted my data to just include the adjacent districts, we instantly see that the means for these are much higher. So that made me think that it makes a difference as far as geography, because on the full sample, you may be getting districts that only have one school in the entire district, because Illinois does have independent school districts. Whereas if you get some of the more concentrated areas, you don't really find it that much. Again, the CPS is in the blue. So again, the student-teacher ratio is much higher in CPS versus the neighboring districts. However, and this is what I thought was very interesting, when it comes to expenditure per pupil, the CPS school district is significantly lower. But we do see after the strike that there is a sharp increase where there's looks like it's going to be some type of convergence at some point. And here, when we looked at the instructional PPE, again, below the average in the area, but it even goes up and actually becomes higher than the other districts in the local area. So, and again, the regression results support that same, you can see that these numbers support the same thing that you saw on the graph. So it appears that the change in instructional PPE outpaced the total PPE in both sets. Again, this could be, like I said before, that the teacher pay was most likely accomplished by reallocating resources rather than increasing educational budgets. And there's lots of literature that talks about how in the state of Illinois, you know, the way that their system is set up, where you could potentially have 3 different school districts taxing the same taxpayers at the same time. Like the high school district, and then you have elementary school districts, and they may all be affecting the same taxpayers. And you're also paying for superintendents for each one. So there's a lot of overlap there, where there may not be availability to move money around because of the way they have it structured, or increase what their educational budgets are. However, the effects are smaller whenever compared to districts that are closer to CPS. And I think that could reflect that there is some type of spillover effects from collective bargaining. Maybe the unions in Lake County, you know, are more likely to be more apt to collectively bargain than they were before, seeing the success of the Chicago Public School District teacher strike. And saying all that to say that striking is always usually the last option, right? No one wants to go on strike. The teachers don't want it, the students don't want it, the parents don't want it. But as I see the strikes unfolded in 2019, it looks like because of there's so many different legislations coming around trying to knock down the role of the unions, looking at the Janus decision that was come by the Supreme Court in 2018, that the power of the unions is being weakened, but so they kind of have to go and get the community support, in order to continue to affect the change for the students. And that's kind of what I came to the conclusion with. And what I would like to do going forward is to gather achievement data for Illinois and see what that looks like versus with the Janus Act and with these two strikes that we had, that I wanted to talk about in this paper. So again, this is very, very early on. There's some ideas I was thinking about. I hope it didn't come out too jumbled. And that's basically all I have.
Thank you so much, Chantel. Just want to remind the audience that concludes our 4 presentations. I'm going to turn things over to our discussants in just a minute. If you do have questions for the presentations, before you forget them, please drop them in the Q&A. And with any luck, we'll have some time to answer them. I didn't discuss with the discussants who should discuss first. I thought we'd just go alphabetically, and maybe Stacy Davis Gates could kick things off for us.
Oh, that's fair. Hello, everyone. My name is Stacy Davis Gates. I am Vice President of the Chicago Teachers Union. Perhaps more importantly, I'm the mother of 3 Chicago Public School students, as well as a high school history teacher myself. So I try to establish my expertise immediately. As you all know and have studied, there is this line of illegitimacy that more of our mainstream critics place on us as unionists. And so I say that not because I need to qualify myself, I say that and that is why common good bargaining is important. And that is why we are absolutely committed to that, because we don't understand bargaining outside of that scope. We provide a common good, public education. And by and large, we understand the impact of austerity. We understand the impact of white supremacy. We understand the impact of racism. We understand the impact of funding formula schemes that have deprioritized the needs of communities of color. And we're at a tipping point with respect to this pandemic because of the exposure with respect to everything in this moment, from the disparities in healthcare, from the disparities in housing, the disparities with respect to how this virus has disproportionately sickened and killed Black people and brown people. All of these things crescendo into school communities that are anchored in larger communities. So not having an understanding of this process is a detriment, quite frankly, to people who are connected in community. What does that mean? It means that we see a bargaining situation that is more inclusive and less exclusive. We've called for open bargaining, where we get stakeholders who are impacted by policy decisions at the table. And those people, by and large, for us, are our parents and our students and their families. What does that mean? It means in Chicago, we had 0 other place to go. You know, so this whole concept of education reform that started percolating with Bill Bennett, who was a Republican Secretary of Education that had labeled Chicago basically a failing place. And what happened in 1995 before Senate Bill 7 was a marginalization of bargaining rights for Chicago educators. And I repeat that because what you saw here was the instigation of Red for Ed. Little known fact, all of our labor siblings in the state of Illinois have more bargaining authority and power than teachers, educators, paraprofessionals, clinicians in Chicago. Our bargaining rights are more akin to those educators in Arizona and Oklahoma and Kentucky and in West Virginia by law. This concept of having 30,000 members out with the support of parents, with the support of communities, has everything to do with us understanding why bargaining rights were marginalized. So we take a very realistic approach in how we assess who we are and our power. In Chicago, at the time of the Mandatory Act in 1995, our profession, predominantly female, and predominantly females, Black women. And these draconian, narrowed bargaining rights meant that there was a precipitous decline in the number of Black women who are now in the Chicago public schools. So anytime you see policies that have a disproportionate impact, you have to evaluate the impetus of that policy. Now, remember, education reform has been created and sold to us on the backs of Black and brown children who exist in lower economic neighborhoods and communities. That education reform, privatizing education, firing bad teachers, all of these things were supposed to help the achievement of students of color. What we've seen is something quite different. We've seen the Black working and middle class marginalized. They've lost their jobs. We've seen the loss of Black schools and Black communities. We've seen the resources in these school communities siphoned off because of the private charter options that have been offered in these communities. And so our union had to undergo a transformation. And it's not a transformation that they wanted to go through. It is a transformation that was led by rank and file members who were able to connect the dots. So it was the members, rank and file members, like they are in Arizona, like they were in West Virginia, like they were in North Carolina, who said, listen, this is not our organization, our union, and it's not speaking to the needs of our members. And it's also too narrow to connect to the people that we are most connected to. And so we took over our union. And in taking over our union, it wasn't just about the power of it. It was about the reconstitution of unionism. And so what we did is that we changed our constitution to reflect we are going to explicitly fight for racial, social, economic, and educational justice, explicitly. So common good bargaining is what we do at the Chicago Teachers Union. We see the strike, much like has already been discussed, as a tool to transform the policies that have marginalized our ability to have a public good that is robust, that is resourceful, and that speaks to the needs of the communities that need it the most. That being said, is that you cannot see your community separate and apart from the struggle of union. Remember, the parents we serve right now, they're working in grocery stores, they're working in nursing homes, they're working in hospitals in all different capacities. And they too are having a very real experience as workers. And so you connect to that experience. I think I saw that research as well, is that you have to see people in the wholeness of the experience that they're having in our country right now. And the ability to connect with people who are also parents, who are also workers, is an important, and it's not a tactic, it's about transforming your space. It is about, if our boat is lifted, your boat should be lifted. Is if their boat is lifted, then of course our boat is lifted. We talk about achievement data and like it's a gold standard. Achievement data is derived from standardized tests. And if you're testing Black children on the South Side or the West Side of Chicago, you are already committing, I think, malpractice, especially when we understand the origins of standardized testing and that it is a tool of white supremacy to prove my inferiority. So you are using the very tool that you know is going to give you the answer that you want to close down 50 schools in the city of Chicago and to fire Black teachers, right? And so it is the job of our union to amplify that measurement is insufficient and it is racist, and it will give you what you need to close us down and to foreclose on the public good, the public sector. What I would say is this, that the policy since 1995 have led to the militancy of teachers unions across this country. And thankfully, that militancy has birthed a type of politic that is intolerant and impatient of further marginalization of the public good, especially now. The fact that the public good since the Reagan era has been defunded means that we can't get vaccines out in a way in which the most of us are impacted in a positive way, right? Because we've taken the infrastructure from the public sector and we've replaced it with these quasi-public-private partnerships that do not respond to the needs of people in the way that they respond to the needs of the economy, right? So we're at a disadvantage. And I hate that I'm all over the place, but I'm trying to meet the time limit. So bear with me and you can hit me back if you need to. And where we've seen these policies hit the hardest is in public education. So follow me here. Every mainstream source of anything is saying that we need to send children back to school because the mental and the mental impact of being isolated in this moment is no good. That there is learning loss, which is a term from the testing industry, by the way, it's going to, be so severe. But you think about what children need when they return to buildings. Well, they need buildings that are actually well ventilated so they will be safe with an airborne pandemic. We know that the facilities across this country, and especially in communities of color, they've been left behind. So they're ill prepared to meet this moment just with that one thing. Number two, every school does not have a nurse. Remember, school nurses is a direct response to the pandemic we had 100 years ago. We received school nurses because of that pandemic. And as we face this pandemic a century later, we're still without school nurses. Where Black children go, where brown children go, and where students who come from low-income environments attend, right? The public sector has been robbed of its ability to actually be of benefit to the very people who need it the most in this moment, and has instead put people who are working within these under-resourced, defunded spaces on the defensive because we're the only ones who can tell you what isn't there and what we need. And the strike is the tool to time out all of these things and to focus on the thing that we need, because the laws have been manipulated, have been structured to create policies that make us believe that the thing that we need the most is there when it really isn't. So the militancy is a direct response to not being heard, to not having enough, and then being forced to provide the actual service that is nearly impossible because the resources aren't there. I'll say this, strikes are transformative. What they have done is provided educators, families, students with an amount of agency that empowers them to fight for more. In Chicago, you saw local school councils, which is the only democratically elected board within our space, reject police in their schools all summer long, right? Because they've seen the power of organizing. They've seen the empowerment that happens when you are unified and well organized. On a larger level, let's look at red state Arizona. The impact of the teacher uprisings there means that there is a progressive taxation there is progressive taxation that was put on the ballot in Arizona that won. I'll say that again. In a red state where teachers rebelled in 2020, they put progressive taxation on the ballot and they won. Is that a coincidence or not? I think that strike, those teachers raising their voices, that organization and empowerment has provided that type of transformation to progressively tax for the actual public good that's necessary. In 2016, we did the same thing. We went on a one-day strike, which immediately provided our schools, Chicago public schools, with resources to actually get through the year. Juxtaposed to that, we received a new funding formula that looks like and sounds like prioritizing students of color and their needs. So it prioritizes special education services. It prioritizes smaller class sizes. It prioritizes bilingual education, to name a few. But those things don't happen without educators, without community, without parents, without families raising their voices for the thing that's necessary. And all of these things, 2012, 2016, and now 2019, I think, and I'm biased clearly, is part and parcel a result of the organized effort to move policies that look like the common good.
Thank you so much, Stacy. And if any of the panelists have any quick reactions, but especially Chantel and Rebecca, I want to give you a few minutes to address some of Stacy's remarks, and then we can move on to William's comments.
I'll just say thank you, Stacy, and I appreciate your comments, but more importantly, I appreciate your work and your ongoing organizing. And I don't want to actually take more time. I would love to continue and hear all the comments and see where we go from there. But the work that has happened in Chicago is absolutely central to all of these questions. Without Chicago Teachers Union, we wouldn't be asking these questions. Hundreds of thousands of teachers would not have gone out on strike. So it's absolutely essential.
I agree. And again, coming from a state that does not have collective bargaining and seeing the terrible infrastructure, horrible teacher pay, and even worse teacher benefits, but that state did participate in Red for Ed was so powerful to me on the outside looking in, because all my friends are teachers. And you're always still trying to root for them, and you're rooting for the students. And I think that based off what you said, Stacy, and what I also know is that it's never teachers against students. It's always teachers for students. And that seems to get lost in the rhetoric. Well, you want more, but it's always for students. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you. And our final discussant of the day is William Spriggs.
Thank you. And thank you for that buffer. Stacy would have been a tough act to follow directly. So I'm asked to comment on the paper from Alexandra, Suresh, and Adam, and then the paper from Maxim and Nathan. I'll start with the paper with that Alexandra prepared, which was an interesting chance to look into how people on the outside are looking at what the what is going on in public labor disputes, and whether they were capturing an essence in it that Stacy was very eloquent in laying out for you. And so it was interesting, of course, to not have to wade through issues of identification and all of those things, but to hear issues from data exploration. And it was interesting to see economists explore, where do priors come from when people are trying to evaluate what would be in their utility function here. Where do they get the information? How does that set of beliefs and values form? And how does an actual action either transform them or not transform them? You heard from Stacy, so you understand that it's possible for a strike to be transformative for non-strikers and for people in the community. And that's what we're finding in their polling results. The results are kind of interesting. I mean, part of this, I think, had to do with the rhetoric of Red for Ed, the early polling results, because these actions took place in states that tended to be red states and where union density is exceedingly low. One would argue, you know, Hank Farber all along argues that most of our measures of union density actually overstate union density. So that would mean that some of these states don't have any unions. We know that's not true, but I'm just saying it's very low. And and so seeing that, it might make sense why you could get this set of conflicts, that you could have the divide between liberals and conservatives about wanting to strike being on a different scale than what you might have anticipated. And it was interesting to see that single women weren't identifying in the same way as married women. All of that has to do, I think, with part of the messaging in Red for Ed, that it wasn't as encompassing as one might have expected in the states that they were looking at, and then spoke to the leadership of those efforts looking a little different than the people who might have wanted to have been affected. So it would have been interesting had you also shown us income, and if there was a little bit more about leadership, the demographics of the leadership versus the demography of the people who are most affected, to understand in a deeper way why this messaging wasn't exactly as we might have anticipated. It's an interesting set of strikes because union density is so low. And as you pointed out in North Carolina, the teachers union there is exceedingly weak because of public sector bargaining rules in North Carolina. And so it still relied on a core of people who were in union-like organizations to generate the energy, the organization to make this happen. But it does speak to the difficulty that we face as we try to organize. I thought the most peculiar thing was finding that people were more in favor after these strikes to want to go on strike than vote for a union. I thought that was the more counterintuitive finding that you posted. I encourage you to continue to do this as exploratory research. I think it is great that we not use our egos as economists to outstrip our knowledge. And I think it's important in this area to continue to seek the knowledge. The paper from Maxim and from Nathan, well, you know, this gets to the deeper issue of, now here there is an issue of identification, because when people go on strike, it's, you know, what part of the bargaining broke down, who has power, who doesn't have power. And we're really not able to see both sides of the setting. And as your data clearly indicated, it's far from a random event. And a deeper problem is we don't actually know what was on the table. So we don't know that, you know, in a world with huge imbalances of power, whether strikes are more likely to occur when you finally push the union to its back. So you don't know whether it's, you didn't get a wage gain, but you didn't know the bargaining offer was a wage cut. Or you don't know whether the bargaining was a huge increase in what was going to have to come out of pocket for healthcare, or that they were going to have to end retirement healthcare benefits. We don't know what the negative was that then would have sparked the union to say that they had to engage in a strike. The decline in strike activity, you know, you can do it all over the board. I get very concerned when I hear people give examples of theories for why strikes are up or down. One thing you mentioned was the principal agent issue of leadership versus the rank and file, and that rank and file might have different wishes. It could also, of course, be the opposite. It could be that unions have become far more democratic, and leadership can't get a strike vote. And so it could also mean more democracy. I think we have to be careful about accepting on the table as legitimate to try and figure out one extreme characterization without balancing it with others. And so in that light, what has happened since the 80s? Well, a couple of things. One, you are very correct about the increased power of bosses because of the use of striker replacements. There is automation, which has meant that we have fewer workers supporting more retirees because we have legacy. By the time you get to the 80s, you really have a legacy issue for labor unions because they have pensions. And because of automation, you have fewer workers supporting more retirees. That upside down structure makes bargaining different now, because those workers not only are thinking about their own raise, but they're thinking about what happens when they retire. And the other thing we have is that healthcare costs have increased faster than productivity. So unions are at a huge twisted point when you get to the 80s between wages, retirement, legacy cost, and healthcare cost for retirees. So I'm not sure that wages necessarily become the only thing, because that whole package is so much bigger. I appreciate that you did look at actual bargaining and tried to match that to firms, and that was, probably going to be far more enlightening because of these complexities. But again, because strikes are so rare, it's very hard to understand whether this is an issue of concession bargaining and the extent to which the concessions that are being demanded are too extreme for the union to take. And so since we don't see that, it's kind of hard to judge whether strikes really have failed, because we don't know what that alternative was. So I hope you can figure out a way to put that in and figure out, what actually might be spurring the strike. Is this a situation where it is concessionary bargaining and it's gone too far? The fact that non-striking workers are seeing similar wages, it'd be nice to decompose between non-striking because they're not unionized. Union density has fallen. Some of the workers in the plant may not be in the union bargaining unit anymore because of the use of temp workers. That's what I meant by they're not union. I know you were looking at data on unions, but it's what's happening in the plant because of the use of temp workers. So these nuances, I think, might help in discerning what the value of strikes are. You do see that pick up as the labor market is tightened just before we went into the pandemic recession, and I think you have to take into account the change in the great moderation of a much higher unemployment rate. The average unemployment rate in the United States in the 80s much higher than in the 70s. And then think about, are these strikes in the 70s unions being aggressive, and it's the employer who's responding and saying whether, thank goodness I held them down to a 3% raise, or is this in the 80s union saying, thank goodness we didn't have to take a 10% cut? So I think that problem of identification is there, and I've gone over time and I apologize.
Thanks so much, William. And I want to open the floor to panelists if they want to respond to William's comments.
Just, I mean, really briefly, thanks, Bill, for those super thoughtful comments. And just on your first point, which is something that we've thought about a lot, you know, we're trying to compare to like a similar group of workers, and we do that slightly differently across the different models. But yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we could point to Jake's work for this. Absolutely, like, you know, largely you don't see unions going on strike, especially in the private sector during this period, in a aggressive, you know, we want X% huge raise. It's absolutely a sort of concessionary bargaining setting for most of this period. And so, yeah, I think that I agree that there's an identification issue there, but we've mostly been thinking about this even just as descriptively interesting, that like, you know, this is what happens for the average worker post-strike, and it's a bit different than what it looked like in the 1970s. And so that's sort of more, you know, we went back and forth a bit with the FMCS trying to get data on collective bargaining agreements that went into mediation but didn't go on strike versus went into mediation and struck, as a way to get kind of a tighter comparison of at least like, you know, two bad situations of bargaining breakdown. But it ended up the sample was super small for they only had data going back the last 10 years. So I agree with all your comments, and hopefully we can do more on it to push towards the kind of more causal interpretation you're looking for.
So I'll just start by thanking you, Bill, for those thoughtful remarks, and then also see if any of my collaborators want to chime in as well. But I'll say that I think the next frontier for a lot of this work is sort of pushing to figure out what the scope conditions of these findings are. As I think you rightly pointed out, the Red for Ed strikes were of had a very distinctive character that was a result of the nature of the states that they unfolded in. You know, the fact that these were particularly the early strikes were in quite conservative contexts in states with relatively weak labor unions and restrictive collective bargaining laws and other labor laws. And so it would be interesting to know whether we would find similar effects in different contexts. Particularly here, I think it would be interesting to think about the earlier wave of strikes that Rebecca alluded to at the beginning of her presentation in the 1960s and 70s. And I think there's evidence that the early wave of public sector strikes, including teachers, were able to generate supportive changes in public opinion. But the later wave of strikes, particularly as they happened in a context where other workers were suffering, generated a great deal of backlash and saw efforts to retrench public sector collective bargaining laws, again, especially for teachers, putting restrictions on their abilities to bargain and collect agency fees. And so I think this question of the degree to which other workers feel common cause, are able to construct an identity that connects them to the teachers becomes really important. And I think that'll differ both based on the broader economic context, as well as as we were hearing from Stacy, the particular strategies that are deployed by unions to engage in public education campaigns with parents, the sort of events that they organize. I mean, all of this, I think, could play an important role in determining whether or not you see these effects in other contexts. I'll end by saying, and here maybe having a teaser to some future work, my collaborators and I fielded a survey of essential workers in April and May of last year, now in 2020, looking at some of the strikes that were starting to happen at the beginning of the pandemic, and we found similar spillover effects, that essential workers who had seen other workers going on strike were more likely themselves to be interested in collective action. So that's at least one other data point to think about how this might apply to other types of sectors and workers.
There we go. We have a question from the audience from James Flowers, and I'll just read it to you. With the number of public school teachers who require supplemental income to make ends meet, would it make sense to measure how those additional working hours may negatively affect their preparation time and personal educational enrichment as they relate to student outcomes? This may help teachers make the argument to parents that the strike is in favor of the students.
I think Stacy might want to get in. I have thoughts on this, but I'd love to let Stacy go ahead.
So I'm just going to speak about Chicago. Our parents already know what it looks like to have 2 jobs or 3 jobs. We're a high poverty school district, lots of working class parents. They get that argument already. That is their argument. If like currently we are locked in a battle about what does a safe reopening look like, where the overwhelming majority of our parents, especially those parents who are Black and brown and living in, working class communities, they are having an experience as a worker. They are most inconvenienced by remote learning, and they are still choosing to keep their children at home because they get, on a very personal level, what it looks like, what it feels like to be in a situation where you are committed to your workspace and you need your boss or the company to provide you with reassurances and a pay wage that is commiserate to the work that you're doing, and you don't receive it. And I think, quite frankly, that's why our connection with our communities at large, and specifically within our school communities, is so strong, is because we identify those things when they are in their struggle. So when Fight for 15, we are partners. When nursing home workers went on strike, we were on the picket line. There is solidarity with our parents as workers too.
Yeah, let me just say a few things about that. One is anytime you tie any of these things to student outcomes, you run into the same problems that we've been talking about and thinking about. And we know that student performance, which we don't have equitable way to measure, is mostly related to things like poverty, school funding, class size, things like that. So I'm not sure how much you would get into it that way. The other thing I would say is I do think it's instructive to understand how many teachers are working multiple jobs. I did a survey with the Vermont Education and National Education Association. I've done work with paraprofessionals in a couple states. And I actually think in terms of public support and the storytelling aspect of organizing, which I think is crucial, the broader public understanding what the economic reality is like for these education workers, I do think is important, because I think a lot of people who haven't been educated, who haven't received the political education that Alex described, have this outmoded notion of a teacher as someone who maybe went to a state teachers college when tuition was very low. They could work their way through college, graduated without debt, maybe saved up for a couple of years for a house down payment, and then bought a house. And the reality of educators now is they're drowning in student loan debt, college tuition, even if they go to their most affordable state institution, even if they do 2 years at community college, is out of control. So they're graduating, drowning in debt. Salaries, huge teacher pay penalty, as we know from Sylvia Allegretto and others. Their health insurance costs are really, really out of control, and they're often trying to support family members. And so they're economically completely stretched, and massive numbers of them are working multiple jobs, whether that's sort of education related, they're doing tutoring or summer school or after school, or unrelated, they're driving Uber, they're working and waiting tables. And so I do think that educating the broader public about that economic reality of being a debt-burdened, multi-job working, do not have summers off because you need to supplement your income, public school educator, I do think that can be valuable. I'm not sure about the relationship between sort of prep time. We know that people who take that pay penalty and become teachers, you know, they're taking that time from their personal time, from their family time, from their sleep, and still preparing and giving their all to students in most cases. But I think there's value in knowing those numbers and getting that out there.
We are running short on time. I want to thank everyone again, all our panelists, our two discussants, Peter Norlander for putting this great panel together. And if there are no kind of last minute questions here, want to bid everyone a good evening, stay safe, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the great papers,